And now it's my pleasure to welcome to the store David Kessler. Dr. Kessler is a pediatrician and lawyer who earned his law degree from the University of Chicago while also working on his medical degree here at Harvard. While completing his pediatric residency, he also served as a consultant for Senator Orrin Hatch on issues of food and tobacco regulation, and he has spent time teaching both medicine and law. In 1990, Dr. Kessler was appointed Commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration by President George H.W. Bush, a post which he held until 1997. While there, he championed transparency in product labeling, introducing the now ubiquitous nutrition facts labels we find on food, and fought hard battles against the tobacco industry. Dr. Kessler's New York Times best-selling book, The End of Overeating, tells the disturbing story of the food industry's manipulation of our natural appetites. While our bodies are clearly designed to alert us when we need to eat or drink, Dr. Kessler shows that through the strategic layering of fats, salts, and sugars, restaurants and food manufacturers have short-circuited those natural processes to make us crave unhealthy foods and to keep us from knowing when enough is truly enough.
That was just a terrific introduction. There were some phrases in there that the manipulation of our natural appetites. I really appreciate that. I thank you, Harvard Bookstore. This is very meaningful. This is very special. I left here 1979. I remember the annex, and just thank you all for being here. It's because of places like Harvard Bookstore and publishers working with independent bookstores that I have the opportunity for me to come and connect. Because when you write a book, it's very interesting. You know, there's that distance, and the opportunity to go around and to talk to people. And what I'd like to do is just spend a few minutes tonight, because there's something that maybe it can happen. I mean, it can happen for a few of you, right? But what I will try to lay out, you know, the answer to a very simple question, right? Why is it so hard to control for some of us our eating? Right? And if you can leave here with a greater understanding of that, if the light bulb can go off, that's something that's very special to me. So let me see if I can put this together. Right? The books are rarely linear. The question you start off with is never the question, certainly for me, that I ended up writing about. So the question that I started writing about was, if you want to stay alive, what can you do? What's the evidence-based literature and on prevention? 3/4 of us are going to die from cancer disease, cardiovascular disease, or stroke. And what do we know that prevents those diseases? So I'm at this little medical school that's south of us in a city that goes unnamed, and I was sitting there with a group of residents and fellows, and asked that question: what's the prevention-based literature? What's the scientific evidence on what works? And there was a librarian who was helping me collect all the literature, and I noticed over a 3-month period she lost 30 pounds. Right? And because she was reading everything, right? And we know it's not good for us, but she was actually, by reading it, it finally hit her, and she lost 30 pounds. Then if it was a question of diet and exercise, I mean, one of your colleagues in the audience tonight remembers about 7 years ago, I went out, what was it, the American Dietetic Association's, because I wanted to know what was driving this. So I went out, right, to listen to all the dietitians, and I will confess, I did not find the answer there, right? I mean, it was very interesting because it was diet and exercise, they were saying. And if that were the case, we'd all do it. So where did I'm listening. I'm trying to understand this, and first I'm trying to understand what's changed, what's happened. Because back when I was a kid in the 1960s, certainly the country was very different then. We had this problem of weights much more under control. So I called my friend Catherine Flegel, who's one of the great epidemiologists at the Centers for Disease Control, and I said, explain to me, when I was growing up, what was weight over a lifetime? What did weight look like? So you entered your 20s, maybe you gained a few pounds between 20 and 40. You were relatively flat, for between 40 and 60, and then you lost a few pounds. But weight was relatively stable over an adult lifetime, right? And then she sent me the curves for the 70s, and then the 80s, and then the 90s, and then 2000. You enter your adult years about 18 pounds heavier. And you also keep on gaining weight much later. So by definition, that can't be genetics, right? Because genetics don't change in 4 decades. So what was going on? So I didn't find the answer at the American Dietetic Association Weight Management. I'm surfing through the channels, and I'm watching Oprah one night. And there's a Dr. Phil segment. Don't get me started on Dr. Phil. Right? And there's a woman, really, please. There's a woman who's on that segment, who's well-educated, very well-spoken, on the set, and said, I eat when my husband goes off to work in the morning. I eat before he comes home at night. I eat when I'm happy. I eat when I'm sad. I eat when I'm hungry. I eat when I'm not hungry. And then she looked in the camera and said, and I don't like myself. That Oprah moment, right? And I was trying to listen as a physician, right? What was driving this woman to do what she didn't want to be doing? That was the question. And as I'm studying this, my sister-in-law, who's here in the audience, said something also that was profoundly important. She says, please don't give us an answer that's something we have to obsess about, right? I've had it with obsessing about anything else, right? So I'm watching this Oprah, right? My sister-in-law uses the word obsession. I'm trying to understand, why is this woman eating when she's hungry and when she's not eating, when she's not hungry? That's what I wanted to understand as a clinician. What was I hearing? Right? So let me give you 5 pieces of the science, and I promise not to lose you. Okay? And then we'll put that together and see if we can explain why this woman and millions like her, right, do what they don't want to be doing. Okay? And what's going on and what's changed over the last 3-4 decades. First piece of science. Walk into the American supermarket, buy what's off the shelves, put it in an animal cage, and feed it to those animals. If you give animals just laboratory chow, their weight from birth to adult is about like this. Add to the cage, just in a limitless fashion, varied and limitless diet. Add the American supermarket diet, bread, crackers, chocolate, to that cage, and weight is like this. Take away that American supermarket diet, put them back on animal chow, and their weight comes down, but doesn't come all the way back down. So first thing, just in a varied and limitless diet, people and animals tend to eat excessively. That's the first piece of science. Number 2, what is it about we published an article called Deconstructing the Vanilla Milkshake, right? Not the typical scientific title for a scientific journal. What's in the vanilla milkshake that drives wanting? Not liking. Wanting. Right? Not whether it's going to taste good, but whether I want it. Is it the sugar? Is it the fat? Is it the flavor? How many of you think it's the sugar? Raise your hands. About a third. How many think it's the fat? Another third. How many think it's the flavor? Another third. How many think it's all 3? Sugar is the main driver. Okay? Animals and people will work more. I mean, again, want it, right? Expend effort. I mean, sugar is the main driver, but add fat to it, and it's synergistic. Okay? They'll work more. So there's something about fat and sugar, fat and salt, fat, sugar, and salt that stimulate you to want it more. Third piece of science. I called a colleague, Gaetano Di Chieri, one of the great pharmacologists in Italy. Gaetano's major work in the 1980s was to find the one unifying feature of drugs of abuse. So he studied brain dopamine. What does dopamine do in the brain? What's dopamine responsible for? What? Happiness, pleasure. That's actually the opioids. Dopamine is responsible for your attention. It gates your attention. It locks in certain neural circuits, right? So it's sort of a filter. It also has an effect on learning. Right? So when you're sitting there, right, if that siren goes by outside, right, you have an elevation. Your attention shifts off me. If a bear walks in here now, you start focusing on that bear. If your kid's sick, whatever is salient in your environment, you're going to focus on. Dopamine plays that role. And what Di Chieri found is that amphetamine, cocaine, heroin, and morphine all elevate brain dopamine, and elevate it every time you give those drugs of abuse. First time, second time, third time. Foods, if you read the textbooks, foods give you a little bump in brain dopamine, but the second and third time, it what scientists call it habituated. You didn't get a rise. Foods weren't as powerful. So I said to Gaetano, let's feed animals, because you have to do it in animals because you're sticking in electrodes, right? Let's feed these animals fat and sugar over a prolonged period of time. So you're conditioning the animal. And then measure what happens when you expose them to the fat, sugar, and salt. What happens to brain dopamine? I remember he sends me the email, important results. He says, I get major rises in brain dopamine each and every time. It doesn't habituate. Right? So if I give very salient stimuli and give it repeatedly, right, you can have continued elevations in brain dopamine. Fourth piece of science. I wanted to understand, right, how many people were like that woman on Oprah. So we did the epidemiology. What was I hearing when I was listening to that woman? I was hearing, what was she saying when she said, I eat when I'm hungry, I eat when I'm not hungry, I eat when I'm happy, I eat when I'm sad. I eat all the time. What was I hearing as a clinician? I was hearing a hard time resisting her favorite foods, sort of a loss of control, self-report. Of course she was in control. I mean, she was conscious, but she had a hard time resisting. Foods were calling out to her. A hard time stopping eating, a lack of satiation. 3, a preoccupation, a thinking about foods. You know that pizza box is there, there's one slice left, you're with your friends or family and you're thinking to yourself, am I going to get that slice? So you have these 3 characteristics, this loss of control, lack of satiation, a preoccupation with thinking about foods. Now some of you in the audience have no idea what I'm talking about. Can't relate, seriously, right? Can't relate to this at all. We'll diverge for a second. The graphic was done by Chip Kidd, the great graphic designer. If you understand this cover, you understand the neurobiology of eating. Okay? Now, tell me honestly, how many of you look at the cheesecake? Raise your hands. It captures your attention. Now, how many of you look at the carrots? Okay, I want to study your brains, not the folks who look at the carrot cake. Right? So, again, this is the concept of attention. What grabs your attention? So what we found was those 3 characteristics. Right? About 50% of people who are obese, 30% of people who are overweight, about 20% of people who are a healthy weight. So it's not just people who are obese, score very high on those 3 characteristics. Now you say to yourself, well, how could people who are a healthy weight score very high on those 3 characteristics? How can they have loss of control, lack of satiation, and preoccupation, thinking about food, and still be healthy weight? Right? Remember my sister-in-law said, don't give me something else to obsess about. Right? So, what happens is, because most psychologists and scientists thought those characteristics were only happened in people who were obese or overweight. They can happen in people who are healthy weight, because and who do they tend to be? Higher socioeconomic women, right? Who, because of their society, right, and the social norms have learned to condition themselves, right, and learned either tricks to be able to deal with it, or they're living with this internal torment, right? Right? Because I have to be able, I react the same way as somebody who is much bigger than I am, but I've learned to control it, and I still have these feelings of loss of control, lack of satiation. So we see about a significant number of people, and if you extrapolate the number of people who have these three sort of conditions, these symptoms, right? You extrapolate, that's some 70 million people. It's a lot of people in this country who would score very high on that characteristic. Now, understand, this is not a disease. I use the words symptoms. It's really not symptoms. This is not a disease, right? I mean, these are the normal circuits of the brain being captured. Because this, I mean, when I say loss of control, lack of satiation, a preoccupation with thinking about foods, that's evidence of a conditioned and driven behavior, right? And so that means we're involving the learning, memory, habit, and motivational circuits of the brain. There's not separate circuits in the brain that are just for food, right? So now here's the last piece of science, right? So we take people who score very high on those three characteristics, that sort of conditioned hypereating, and we scan their brains. And we do it in two phases. The first phase, we just cue them. I mean, where does the power of food come from? Where the power of food comes from, well, it certainly comes from taste. All right, if I ask you to think about your favorite food right now, the memory, right? You can almost taste the food. You could smell it. You could, I mean, right? So, I mean, but interestingly, it's not just the taste. As you said, it's the anticipation of that taste, right? So what you have to really do if you want to study how people react to food is do it in two stages. First, you just cue them. What's a cue? It could be the sight. It could be the smell. It could be the time of day. Every time I land in San Francisco airport, I start thinking about these dumplings. The plane is the cue. You know, it is, I mean, I just come to Harvard Square and I get cued and start having memories of places 30 years ago that are no longer here. Right? We're such effective learners. So we get cued, right? And so what we do is when you scan people who have this conditioned hypereating, right, and you cue them, what do you see? You see exaggerated, increased activation of the brain's amygdala. So there's excessive, and the brain's amygdala, that's the emotional core of the brain. And when you give them the food to eat, the amygdala stays activated excessively until all the food is gone. So there's a biological reason, right? And I can show it to you on these brain scans of why people have a hard time resisting, right? So for the first time, you sit there and you say that I say that to people, and the light bulb goes off, and they say, "You're telling me," because this is automatic behavior. Right? I mean, if Freud had gotten it right, he would have talked about automatic. I mean, the unconscious is really about automatic behavior because this response, my brain is being activated before the conscious elements of my executive control go into effect. Right? So you have people say for the first time, "You mean I'm not to blame? This is my brain?" Right? I mean, and that is, you know, a very important point. The problem is not weight. The problem is what we're eating. Let's see if we can put this all together. Let's see if I can make sense of this. Okay. We're all wired to focus on the most salient stimuli in our environment. Okay. What's a salient stimuli? You know, the great Harvard psychologist, I mean, I emailed him back a couple of years ago. I said, what makes something reinforcing? Right? And what's the characteristics? Jerome Kagan said to me, it's anything that can change how you feel. So that bear who comes in here can make me feel bad, right? Or that carrot cake, right, can make me feel good. And both are salient stimuli, right? So we're all wired to focus on the most salient stimuli. What could that be? It could be alcohol, it could be tobacco, it could be illegal drugs, it could be sex, it could be gambling. What's the most socially acceptable salient stimuli in our environment. And what's at the core of that food today? Fat, sugar, and salt. So pick any, and I understand this is Cambridge, and we're living, this is not, how do I say this? This is not America, right? When it comes to, right, food, right? But pick any appetizer, you've all traveled, right? Pick any appetizer in a modern American chain restaurant. I mean, what are we eating today? I mean, pick buffalo wings. What are they? You start off with the fatty part of the chicken, you load 30-40% fat when you fry it in the manufacturing plant. That pushes out 30-40% of the water. It's fried again in the kitchen, usually, of the restaurant. That loads another 30-40% fat in there. The red sauce, what is it? Right? And the white creamy sauce? Fat and, right. So what are we eating? Fat, unfat, 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 unsugar, unfat, sugar, and salt, right? I mean, with a little protein, right? I mean, if you look at salad has become what? Salad is the delivery vehicle for fat, right? I mean, Kennedy Airport, they now have the calorie menu labeling for calories. The salad's 1,500 calories. Right, with the dressing, with the bacon, with the cheese, with the croutons, right? If you look at France, I mean, what did we do in the United States? Right? What's been the business plan of the modern American food company? You got to make profits, right? How do you make profits? You got to have increased revenue. How do you have increased revenue? You have to have growth, right? You want to increase profits, increase growth. How do you do that? Right? You got to either raise the price of your food, if you want to increase, or you got to sell more food. Whether we need it or not, you got to put more calories out there. But what's been the business plan? Take fat, sugar, and salt, put it on every corner, make it available 24/7, make it socially acceptable to eat anytime, make food into entertainment, add the emotional gloss of advertising, walk into a food mall in America, and we're living in a food carnival. What did we expect to happen? Right? But how does this work? Okay? Right? So we get cued, right? A cue can be the sight, it could be the smell. A cue is going to differ for all of us. It's based on past learning and past memory. There was a guy who told me the hardest thing for him to do every day is to get on that train at the end of the day at work, because that newsstand that he has to go by, those Kit Kats. He had to run past that newsstand. Right? You know, some of you may not even react to Kit. I mean, for him, that past experience with the Kit Kats, it was, you know, this guy was a huge guy, strong. I mean, everything else, and those Kit Kats he couldn't deal with, right? So he gets cued, right? The cue activates the brain. It causes arousal. It causes this increased attention. These thoughts of wanting. It activates the brain's amygdala. You're not thinking about anything else. You're just thinking about this. I mean, all cognitive control sort of dissipates because, I mean, you really feel, I mean, the urges, the feelings, right? I want this. I eat the food I have the momentary bliss, right? 2 minutes later, I say to myself, what did I do? The next time I'm cued, what do? I do it again, and every time I do it, I strengthen the neural circuits. So, and I mean, just compare us to the French. The French have eaten highly palatable foods, but they've always had. Why haven't they until recently gotten obese? One is portion sizes, right? But also, if you look, they have erected. They've always had certain barriers, right? They built-in barriers to this chaotic and continuous eating. Their social norms. They would never eat between meals. They would never walk down the street eating. They would never eat in the car. They would never eat at work. They would never, you know, be drinking coffee and things, I mean, in a lecture, right? I mean, what have we done in the United States? We've taken down all those barriers. The tagline for Taco Bell, the fourth meal, right? I mean, so I'm invited to one of the global multinational food companies. Right? And they say, all right, tell us as it is. We need to hear the reality. So I said, let me explain this to you. And you got to be careful with this analogy because there's similarities and differences. Nicotine. Nicotine is a moderately reinforcing chemical. Animals will work for it, but it's not that reinforcing. Add to the nicotine the smoke, the throat scratch, the cellophane crinkling of the pack, the color of the pack, the image of the cowboy, the sense that it was sexy and glamorous, to smoke, and certainly in my parents' grandparents' generation. What did we do? We took a reinforcing chemical and we made it into a highly addictive product. I give you a package of sugar and say, go have a good time. You're going to say, what are you talking about? Add to that sugar fat, add texture, add color, add mouthfeel, add the emotional gloss of advertising, put it on every corner, say you can do it with your friends. Right? What did we expect to happen? The consequences, the health consequences. Understand this hard time resisting this conditioned and driven behavior. Again, it's not a disease. Our brains, you cannot walk down the street without being cued for 10 feet. Right? And those are very, very powerful cues. All right, so now you want to know how do I turn it off? Okay. All right. Now this is the hard part. Right? Because if it was the easy part, everybody would have figured this out. Right? And in some ways, the harder you work at it, right? It's the more you think about it, the more you focus on it, the more that stimulus stays in working memory, the harder it is. Those circuits continue to focus. You know that inner dialogue? This would taste great. No, not now. I shouldn't do this. As you're thinking about it, right? Because this is not only the conditioned circuits, but the motivational circuits, right? But if you understand this cycle of cue, activation, arousal, reward, release, where can you intervene? What can we do? Right? You ever gonna get rid of those circuits? No. So you're always going to be able to respond to the most salient stimuli in your environment. Except there's a small percentage of the population. What was the name of the pilot? Sullenberg. So he's a guy who, I've just lost both engines. I'm over the Hudson. I have no power, and I just have to land this plane in the Hudson River, no problem. Right? No emotional reactivity. Right? So there are people like that. Right? Now, you got to wonder what else he finds salient, but maybe not other things. But there are some people who are low dopamine receptor. We don't fully understand this. I go into restaurants and I watch people eat. I watch couples, and one of them eats 3/4 of their sandwich, and the other reaches over to eat the fries of the other one. Right? There probably is some genetics here, but it's not about food. Some of us are more outgoing. We don't have a good word in the English language. Some of us are more impulsive when it comes to external stimuli. Others of us are more resistant, right? So there is that underlying trait. But a lot of this is experience and past memory. So, all right, now I've given you the cycle. How do you prevent it? You can't prevent it, but how do you cool it down? Right? I can't change. You're going to respond to salient stimuli. So now that you know that, a diet's going to work. Why? Well, the diets are not going to work, but certainly you'll lose the weight, right? So 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, I deprive myself, right? But if I want it, right, and I haven't laid down any new neural circuitry, if I haven't laid down any new learning, I'll lose the weight. I'll just white knuckle it, right? But then after the diet is over, I go back into my environment. I get cued again. If I haven't laid down any new neural circuitry, new learning, I'm still going to respond to those cues. What's going to happen? I'm going to get back all the way. So what are my options? You know how this works now. What can you do? What? So how do I change my behavior? How do you lay down new neural circuits? But how do you do that? You know your cues.
Have different thoughts. Maybe take away some of your own cues that you're bringing.
All right, so let's talk about. So I get rid of the stuff in my house, right? But then I turn on TV or walk outside, right? The one thing that the dietitian community, if you look at, that does work, and it's true. If you look at the French and you study that helps calm down the constant bombardment and activation, is if you have some structure to your eating. right? So if you have structure to your eating, you know when you're going to eat and what you're going to eat, right? That helps. But what's the great public health success to date so far? Smoking. What did we do? How did we change it? We didn't change the cigarette, the actual cigarette itself. We didn't change. It's not laws and regulations, right? It's more expensive. That helped. That changed it. We certainly education. But is it really about knowing? Why? Okay. So the social norm changed, right? So it's what psychologists call a critical perceptual shift. That used to be cool to smoke, right? This is not about this is not just about information. This is not about just knowing. I mean, this is at the emotional level. You look at that. I mean, you used to view cigarettes as my friend. That's going to make me feel normal. Now, how do we, as a country, view it? As a deadly, disgusting product. But there's a visceral reaction. So let's talk about processed foods, right? Back in the 1930s and 1940s, in order to feed a hungry nation, what did the food industry learn to do? They learned to process foods. There were a lot of advantages to that. They learned to advantages of processing food. You can ship food over long distance. It was cheaper. It was greater shelf life. Foods were safer if there's greater shelf life. Right? There were advantages. What did the food industry learn to do when it processed the food over time? What did it learn to dial in? Fat, sugar, and salt. What did it also do? Processed foods, by the nature of the processing, it takes out anything that's objectionable. It takes out anything that slows down eating. I mean, if you eat a real food, I mean, 20, 30 years ago, we chewed on the average of 20, 30 bites, 20, 30 chews per bite. Today, I mean, if you eat processed food, everything objectionable is taken out. Everything that slows down eating, any structure, right? So the food goes down in a wash. I mean, we're eating adult baby food. We're just self-stimulating ourselves. We're eating for reward. I mean, understand the implications of this, right? I mean, if the behavior is conditioned and driven, right? I mean, that has enormous policy implications because it's not just us, it's our kids. Because once you lay down that neural circuitry, you're laying down that neural circuitry for a lifetime. Yes, you can add new learning on top of that, new neural circuitry. Right? But the average 2-year-old child compensates for their eating. What do I mean? If you give that child more food at lunch, they'll eat less during the rest of the day. By the time that child is 4 or 5, the majority of them lose the ability to compensate. They lose the ability to regulate. They're eating all through the day. Right? But how do I cool down the stimulus? So what did we do in tobacco? We changed the social norms. There was this critical perceptual shift. Tobacco, though, was easy. I could live without tobacco. Food, I need food to eat. Food has to be pleasurable. If I look at that plate of fries, I mean, I can tell whether somebody's going to be able to be successful on a diet. If you look at that piece of cake or you look at those fries and say, I want that, that would taste great, right? But I'll deprive myself. I know over the long term it's not going to work. It's just going to be inner torment. Until you change how you look at the stimulus, if you look at that stimulus and say, I want that, the emotional core is being activated. Right? And the only way to do it is to change what you eat and what's important here. With women, very interesting. Many women do not, especially caregivers, right? They care about everyone else, and there's a moment in their life where they finally say, I'm going to do this for me, right? And it becomes important. It becomes salient. Right? I can't lecture about this. I mean, I can't tell you what to eat. I can't tell you what to change, right? Because you have to decide for yourself what you want. No one can tell you. I mean, you don't sell diet books here, do you? Right? I mean, they may jump. Ellen Goodman, thank her. Said it's end of Overeating. It was the non-diet diet book. I think is the way because it was not meant. I can't tell you. No one could tell you, right? What you want. No one could change that for you. And people can help jumpstart, right? And if you look at every diet has some gimmick to get you started, right, and lose weight quickly, so it's reinforcing. But unless you change, you have new learning. Unless you change how you respond to cues, and the only way to change how you respond to cues is to change what you want. Why don't we open up for questions? And you still are not. This is Burlington, Vermont, still, has one up over you, right? I mean, the McDonald's moved out of town. I mean, right? So, and we will know we're on the right track. I mean, when our kids come to us and say, "Mom, Dad, please don't take me to McDonald's," right? But let's go to your 3 points in those institutional, because understand this, and it's the last part of the book. It's the epilogue, right? And I'm working on another book, because I'm convinced that if you understand overeating, or what's driving overeating, you will understand much of our anxieties, our obsessions, our phobias, some of our depressions, some of our mania, right? Because these are the same circuits that get triggered. So how does yoga work, right? What does it work on, right? But what? And how does it work? So how does exercise work? I mean, the value of exercise, right, is it's a substitute reward. Exercise is not important. The reason to engage in exercise is not because you're going to lose the calories from exercise. I mean, I can eat a candy bar, 300 calories, in a minute and a half, and it would take me an hour to work it off. So it's never going to be equally balanced, right? But while I'm exercising, I'm going to feel good about myself, right? And all that stress, right? I mean, that's a reward. It's a substitute reward. What's yoga? For those who are into it, it's a substitute reward, right? What were your other examples? Mindfulness, again. It's a lot of people view that word with a lot of different meanings. Is it increased awareness, right? Is it really understanding if my brain gets cued and I have thoughts of wanting, right? Is it to understand that thought and let that thought go, right? Again, no disagreement. I mean, that's it. The core. If you're going to get cued, understanding that it's a false cue. I think I'm hungry.
Or it's self-regulation.
What is self-regulation? We use these words, but it's being able to deal with these cues, and that our brains are being activated. I mean, most eating occurs when? Most overeating occurs between 5 and bedtime. Why? I've had a long day. I just got the kids to bed. I've had all this stress, and if I can sit there with the ice cream or the cereal and just continue in this automatic cycle, it's optimized. The fat, sugar, and salt will optimize that bliss point. I will feel great. I'll have the activation of those opioid circuitry. All the other stresses of the day fall off. It works great. I feel great for a couple of minutes, and then after that, how do I feel? Right. But the issue with yoga or mindfulness, and what was the third? Local food, right? Does it become salient? Is it something you care about? Right? If I look at that piece of chocolate cake and say, that's what I care about, I'm gonna find that rewarding. If I care about going to my yoga class, if I care about local food, where are we headed as a country?
Well, my point is we're inculcating health values in that part of the culture, but not in the country.
Well, the issue is what's the food movement that's going to emerge, right? And how do these things emerge? I mean, something has to become more important. To lay down new learning, to new neural circuitry, something has to become more important to you. That's really what new learning is, and something has to have greater value to you, right? So some people view food, and they look at it, it's the ethical treatment of animals. I don't want to eat, I care about that, because that's what's important to me. Others look at, I want to be vegetarian, a derivative of that. Some people say, I want to eat organic, right? Some people say, I want to eat just local food. Then that becomes the salient. That becomes meaningful to you. That evokes the emotional response. And then you look at the highly processed food and you go, it's disgusting, right? Now, so because that's what it's going to take. I mean, I can tell you, I have suits in every size, right? And until you start changing how we look at food, I agree with you, and provide other things we want more, we're never going to lay down the neural circuitry. Okay, so let's see if we can all get on the same, because I never understood grams and milligrams, right? And I will tell you the.
No idea.
You,
That's what
you,
they say.
you said 700. Well, let's see if we can leave here. So, the average, what we did, and I'll tell you the story of the food label before we leave. You remind me to tell you the story of how the food label almost didn't happen, right? There's two numbers on the food label. There's one is the amount of grams or milligrams, and you said 700 milligrams of sodium, and then there's something called daily value, which is 100% should be my daily allowance of how much sodium I should have. The daily value for sodium, I mean, on the label is 2,400 milligrams. FDA is basically considered in any serving, anything greater than 20% is high, right? So you can look and see whether the percent daily value is greater than 20%, or the amount of sodium would there be greater than about 400 milligrams. Why don't they take it down? Right? They will argue, look, we're just giving consumers what they want.
But I don't want that.
Right. And if that's the case, if in fact
I don't buy it.
you don't buy it, right? And that will change manufacturer behavior, ultimately. But I mean, what they're doing in essence with that sodium is they're just stimulating that neural circuitry. I mean, fat and salt are very highly reinforcing. They're very stimulating. I mean, why do I keep eating these potato chips, right? So the question is, do I make more money with higher sodium, or do I make more money with less sodium? I mean, also, everyone should know the IOM issued a report that was really a transformational change, because it used to be, certainly when I was in medical school, here across the river, the conventional wisdom is that some of us, not all of us, are sensitive to salt. Right? What the IOM, the Institute of Medicine, has now said is we can all benefit from a reduction in salt. Right? And I think people want, and you can, to your point, right? You can change salt slowly over time. The palate is adaptable. I walked in. I went to a Thai restaurant, and the other day, and the sauce, she said it was sweet and sour, and I said to her, "Now tell me honestly, how much sugar do you add? And I mean, in your home country, is it as sweet? It's a very authentic dish." She said, "No, we make it sweeter for Americans." I mean, everything is sweeter here, right? I mean, our palate has changed over the years, and it's not just sugar. Please, artificial sweeteners can stimulate. Manufacturers will respond to, if there's enough consumer demand, they will change. So the hope is, right? How do we turn this around? I gave the same lecture to a group of scientists and diabetologists, except I used slides. I put up the scientific data, and they looked at it, and they basically, at the end of it, said, "We're toast as a country," right? Because if you understand the behavior, the neural circuits get laid down, right? And they get laid down in children, and the environment is triggering that behavior. How do you ever get out of it, right? I mean, that's what you're asking. I do think, and my hat is. I mean, I think Michael Pollan, Alice Waters, with due respect to my colleagues in the dietitian and nutrition community, I think two of them, certainly Michael, has done more for nutrition. I mean, to awareness, right? And I think that, if we can move, I mean, we made a mistake in the food label. Okay, we got to the point where we believed, where it says 0 fat and 0 sugar and 0 calorie. I mean, you should just look for the lowest numbers, right? And I fell for that, right? So I sit there and I drink my Diet Coke, and I eat my frozen yogurt that has nothing in it, and I realize that I'm not eating food. So the incentive we created in some ways was for the food industry just to add chemicals, right? If you just look for zeros. So I think your point about, I went into one of my local restaurants in San Francisco, and certainly has the same, I think, the values as here. And I said, in Cambridge, I said to the chef at my local restaurant, tell me, what's the most important question I can ask when I eat out? When I walk into a restaurant? What do you think he said? He said, ask where the food's from. I will tell you, I will go next door and ask where the food is from, and we'll see whether they can tell me, right? But it's not a question I normally ask. And I do think if this is going to require a change in values, right? And it's going to, one of the reasons why, I didn't do it deliberately, but I went inside, the Washington Post outed me, right? Because I went dumpster diving, right? To find out what was in restaurant foods. And when you go in and you see the food is really just constructed, it's assembled, it's not even cooked in the vast majority of places where America eats. It's so highly processed. It's adult baby food. I wish I were I could understand pricing behavior. Look, somebody's going to ask me the question about, fast food, isn't it cheaper than real food? And it's a complex answer, and I think we need to confront it. First of all, obviously, there's no reason why to continue to subsidize fats and sugars and corn. It just doesn't make sense, right? We should subsidize real food and make it available, right? I can't tell you, why that can is priced differently. But I can tell you, if you sit there and eat junk food all the time, you're just continuously eating it, and in the end of the day, it may not be. You may think it's on any individual food it's cheaper, but if you keep on eating it and you can't stop, it gets pretty expensive to eat junk food. Two interesting points. Would you invest in Nestle with that business model, right? So you want to do healthy processed foods that are like pharmaceuticals, right? And is that going to work? Understand which circuits are we dealing with in the brain? We're dealing with the learning, memory, habit, and motivational circuits. Is a drug going to work? Sure, a drug can work. It's called speed, right? It'll affect those circuits. But understand, if I affect those circuits pharmacologically, you'll lose weight. Fen work, but you have to give me back some IQ points, or it's going to have another serious adverse event, because you're fooling around with the learning, memory, habit, and motivational circuits, right? Second point, right? And I know my colleagues, are talking about green light, red light, or healthy choice and other things. How could you ever think about that you're going to do processed foods that by its very nature is energy dense, that takes out the hydration, that takes out anything real in the food, and make it healthy? So what's Nestle going to sell? Well, I wish them well. I wish them well. To your point about Michael Pollan on eating the Savannah diet of 20,000 years ago, I love Michael. I think his books are great, and I think he's done a lot for nutrition. I'm not sure I would revert. There was a lot of heart disease, right? There was a lot of other diseases. Now, there was smoking, and there are other causes of those things. But if you talk, it's not just calories. You talk to the great Walter Willett. Saturated fat, really does have an independent risk factor for cardiovascular disease, independent of calories. So I'm not sure we revert back, to a diet of even 50 or 100 years ago, right? Again, the most important, food has to be pleasurable. It has to be enjoyable, right? You got to figure out what you want, right? But I think if you do that, and I think if it's real food, right? and I think it can work. I think you can explain to them, right? I think it worked in tobacco, right? You tell the kids, I mean, the legacy campaign, the truth campaign, what does an adolescent, what does a kid care about? Certainly an adolescent, a little older kid, right? They don't want to be manipulated by adults. They want their autonomy, right? So if you tell them that somebody is getting rich off hooking your brain, right? So if you could show them really what's in the food, and if you just explain to them what's in food and get them to want, real food, right? But it has to emotionally resonate. So I think you can explain to them, you can show them, you can do it at a very graphic level. You can relate to what their concerns are. I don't want to have my brain hijacked. I don't want to be manipulated by some food industry. I don't want to just eat all this processed foods, because that's just going to keep me eating more. You're going to have to talk in their language. Or younger kids, they want energy. They want to be able to play sports. You can relate to in those terms. But again, and the jury's not. The jury is still out. Even if I'm perfect with my kids for the first 5 years, am I going to protect those neural circuits over a lifetime? We certainly know when people who come to this country, even later on in years, that their brains can get hijacked. So we remain vulnerable. But it's likely, if you really instill the values of real food, the values of not eating, and understand, we have a choice in this country. We can either, with tobacco, we can either demonize big food, or we can celebrate the joys of real food. Which is going to be more effective with your kid? We certainly demonize the tobacco industry, right? But you can't demonize food. You got to be careful, right? Because you do that, then you can get into the eating disorders and the fears and other things. So you're walking a very fine line. So a lot of points in your question, a lot of great points in your question. Make sure let's take them one by one. No question, when people didn't have time to prepare meals, right? The lack of, the enormous number of people who don't know how to cook, right? Juggling multiple jobs, male or female, right? All that contributed, right? So you have that, plus the rise of food becoming convenient and mobile. Right? You have a lot of these forces at play. But I think you're also getting at another point where eating with some structure. If you look at the French and you look at the Swiss, I think it's still, they care about, the eating at dinner, eating at a meal is salient to them. That's their social norm. That's important. That has meaning for them. They don't want to just go out. We've sort of, transposed it, certainly in higher socioeconomic. We still have the meal. We do it with friends, but we do it in restaurants. We take out all those. The important point is those social norms, those change in sociological factors can have a real effect on how I respond to stimuli. Right? The social norm, that social value, affects whether my brain is going to be activated or not. Last story, the food label. Everyone knows the nutrition facts panel, right? So it almost didn't happen. You know how the government works? So no. Cheese pizza is regulated by the FDA. Add pepperoni to it, it's regulated by the United States Department of Agriculture. Go figure. So you add meat and poultry, it's USDA. So we wanted to do a combined label, food label, between USDA and FDA on all processed products, including products that had meat and poultry. Secretary of Agriculture said to me one day, he says, I don't like we showed him the label we wanted to put on, the fat, the sugar, the calories. He says, I don't like it on my products because meat and poultry and higher fat, he thought those products won't look as good. And he said, I'm going to take it to the president. I said, you're what? He said, I'm going to take it to the president. So fast forward into the Oval Office. George Bush, the father, Dan Quayle, the vice president, Marlon Fitzwater, the press secretary, James Baker, who was chief of staff, the secretary of agriculture, the secretary of health and human services, 6 guys who've never cooked in their lives deciding the fate of the food label. I will admit, we had worked with McDonald's to put the nutrition facts panel, right, the replica on these tray liners, these paper tray liners. No, you don't even know what those are in Cambridge, right? But I had been with the kids, and I had saved some of those tray liners that had the nutrition facts. And when the Secretary of Agriculture said to the President, Mr. President, FDA has lost its mind. It's going to cost the food industry millions and millions and billions of dollars, in fact. Pull out the placemat, hand the placemat. So now you have these 6 guys looking at this McDonald's placemat, right? And say to the President, Mr. President, if it's good enough for McDonald's, it should be good enough for the Department of Agriculture. And the President agreed, and that's how policy is made in this country. Thank you very much. Thank you, Harvard Bookstore.